Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Joelle Kuzam with the newly merged and expanded firm of Bricker Graydon. I'm also a member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and I'm so pleased to be with you today. Let's thank today's forum sponsors, Delta Airlines, and today's forum partners, the Columbus Council on World Affairs and NBC4. We are also grateful to the Grange Insurance Audubon Center and its amazing staff for their ongoing support. Thank you as well to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation for presenting today's live stream, which is carried on CMC's social media platforms. Let's thank all of our supporters for today's forum. And now today, to welcome our speakers, please welcome to the podium CMC's President and CEO, Jane Scott. Jane.
Thank you, Joelle, and thank you all for being here. Born in the country of Georgia, our special guest speaker today followed in his father's footsteps into the career of diplomacy. He served as something equivalent to the chief protocol officer for Mikhail Gorbachev and was actually standing nearby Gorbachev when he announced his resignation as president, which led to the fall of the Soviet Union. After that, our speaker took a position at the United Nations in New York City, which is where he was when I met him in 1993. He's held several very high-level roles in the United Nations, and currently he serves as the Chief of Staff for the Office of the Director General of the United Nations in Geneva. He's also brought a very special guest of his own with him today, his wife, our friend Maya. I'd like to recognize her. We're tickled that you're able to be here with us. So it's my pleasure and indeed an honor to welcome my dear friend David Chikvaidze. David, welcome back to CMC.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
On stage with David is an award-winning journalist, a familiar face for us, who's reported the news in our community for a few years. I was going to say, but never. And she's one of this year's Women of Achievement honorees. CEO Magazine just did a fabulous, fabulous article calling her our media maven, which I love that. Do you like that?
It's what old women are called.
Oh, former CMC board member and also a good friend from co-anchor NBC4, Colleen Marshall.
Thank you.
You can read more about them in our forum flyer, and Colleen and David, it's all yours.
Thank you.
Well, I think you are going to find him as fascinating as I have in the hour or so that I've known David, and what a world perspective you have. And I'm going to take you back in time when you stood at the shoulder of Gorbachev. That was the start of your diplomacy, and when you think about it, what a way to start. You started at the top of one of the most powerful countries in the world. What was it like as you watched the changes that came during the Gorbachev years, but also what happened almost immediately after?
Thank you very much, Colleen. Before I answer that question, let me say how pleased I am, and Maya and I, that we're back in Columbus. It is a very warm city that has welcomed us before. It's a terrific community, and I'm very happy to see a big cross-section of this community. We were here 5 years ago in the same role at CMC, and as I was telling Jane last night, it's important, not as important to be invited to the birthday, but invited next year is even more important. So despite my statement 5 years ago where Mike Thompson was in your role, and halfway through my presentation, he said, should we run for cover? Despite that, I'm back, and it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much, and to have somebody as well-known and as professional as Colleen Marshall to moderate this. But again, before I answer, I want to first and foremost, of course, start by thanking my friend Jane Scott, who is the engine behind all this and has been, simply because we're good friends. And we worked together well on projects before, and it's really a great pleasure to have friendships. I value friendships that last, and voila, this is one of the results of this particular friendship. So thank you, Jane. Now, getting back to Gorbachev, that was not my beginning. My beginning was as a Soviet diplomat in Washington, D.C. I was a junior diplomat. I arrived in 1985. This was already Gorbachev's time, and it was a totally different time. If you all are watching what's happening between the Russians and the Americans today, nothing to do with that 5 years that I spent in Washington. It was I don't know, it was the heyday of the relations. Both countries were opening up to each other. There was curiosity. Sure, there was animosity. There was an ideological divide. But you didn't feel that divide because both sides were trying to come together, find points of contact, and there was an increasingly friendly dialogue. More than that, I don't know if some of you caught this, but I came out with an op-ed 3 years ago on the 90th anniversary of former Secretary of State James Baker. And I was describing in part that time when I was on the Soviet side. I was chief of protocol, among other things, at the embassy, and Baker's team. We were working towards the same goal. We weren't working against each other. And when you see what's happening now in their relationship with the United States, the Russians, it's just night and day. But Gorbachev was, of course, a pinnacle, but also an end, because that moment that you're referring to, that Jane referred to, was his abdication speech. And I was standing in front of, behind the camera, or next to the camera. I must have had such a sour face that Tom Johnson, at the time president of CNN International, he looked at me and he took off his CNN watch. It wasn't much of a watch, but it was a CNN watch with CNN on the dial, and he kind of nudged me and said, "If you ever need a job, come and see me," which I appreciated very much. I still have the job. I never went to ask him for a job, but I still have the watch. I keep it in good running order. It was, I knew what was coming. I'd seen what was coming, but when that thing was over, I went one floor down to my office and kind of slumped back and stared at the wall for a couple of hours, just trying to wrap my brain around it. I'm not a weak sort of, individual. I know, I could see what was coming. I already had ideas what to do. But when it happened, it was like, okay, where do I go from here? And the reason for that was because I was standing in the space of 19 minutes that he was making the abdication speech. I was standing in the same room, in the same building, in the same city, in a different country, because I come from Georgia, and my country, somewhere in those 19 minutes, broke off on the periphery. It was a totally different feeling for my Russian friends and colleagues who were standing in the same room. Yeah, for them also things changed, but they didn't feel that there. They were in their own country. I found myself in a different country. So it was a difficult moment. And that's when I started thinking, so what do I do? Do I stay behind and, make believe that I'm Russian, or do I go back to Georgia? Nobody at the time was inviting me. What do I do? I was a part of a larger country, and I told all this over drinks before dinner to the former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, Ambassador Jack Matlock. And a couple of months later, he showed me a draft of his first chapter in his memoir, which I suggest those who are interested in that era, you look up and read, not because he starts and finishes it with my narrative, but because it really is, it's called Autopsy on an Empire. And he did a terrific autopsy. It came out in June 1995. 645 pages. So he used that to hang his narrative on, that there was this guy who was, a little bit discombobulated, but found his way out. So it was pretty much like that for a lot of people, and some people found their way out, others didn't. But it was a major change. I think the most important aspect of my answer to that question would be, did we do a good job learning the lessons of that period? I'm not sure we did, because 32 years down the road, we're in a situation which is pretty uncertain.
And I want to ask you about that situation, because back then we did look at Russia differently. There was this feeling that, okay, we are the world leaders, Russia and the US at that time. Soviet Union, were considered to be the powers, the major powers in the world. Now we have Russia and Vladimir Putin, who's a very different leader than Gorbachev was, and we have America internally fighting on how we deal with Vladimir Putin and his invasion into Ukraine. Are you concerned, from your seat at the UN now, of this continuing crumbling of the relationship that we have with Vladimir Putin?
Well, let me back up for a moment here. Maybe I should have said this at the outset. What I say is not the UN official position. Although you can't get away from the title on your card entirely, but I'm not towing the party line. I never did that even when there was a party. So on the one hand, I am sort of giving my impression of things, but you can't get away from the fact that I do work for the United Nations, and I do remember all the time that I, as an international staff member, I serve all countries equally. So I can't take sides, although when international law allows you to take sides, you do. Like the Secretary General, my big boss, came out very clearly and said that this is not right. You cannot invade countries and resolve issues by invading countries. So, in that sense, there's clarity on that. We go by UN resolutions, we go by UN positions, and so on. Now, your question has a lot of interesting facets to it, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it in a concise way, do it justice, but the US and the Soviet Union were two of the biggest boys, quote unquote, on the block. However, the Soviets always had this inferiority complex. If you remember the word parity, nuclear parity. They were dreaming to achieve nuclear parity with the United States. Parity meaning rough equivalence in weapons. And the reason for that was not because the Soviets were planning to attack the United States. If anything, all the rhetoric was about peace and peaceful coexistence with a different system, albeit understood differently by the Soviets. It was peaceful coexistence in order not to have a war, but benefit from technology and economic relations and so on and so forth. But it was still not a war-fighting search for parity. And they did achieve rough parity. Because when you have, let's say, 1,500 nuclear charges, whether warheads or howitzer shells or whatnot, it really doesn't really matter if you have 1,570 or 1,600. You're basically dead 10 times over if something goes wrong. And that sort of brings me to a philosophical statement that First, there was the word. And what I mean by that is there was rhetoric, and it depends to a great extent on what kind of rhetoric. Because what we saw, and one of the reasons why my presentation 5 years ago was kind of, should we head for the hills? Because the rhetoric had already gone south between America and Russia. And rhetoric is very important, just like hate speech. You know, if you remember 1994, the genocide in Rwanda, before they started hacking people to death with machetes, coming to a grand total of over 800,000 people dead in the space of like 3 months, there was hate speech. There was a radio station called Radio Mille Collines, 1,000 Hills. And they were horrible. If you listened to them, it was, made you cringe what they were saying. And that led to radicalization and then to the genocide. And if you were following, there was basically an equivalent, maybe not as vitriolic, but hate speech with regard to Ukraine and the Ukrainians, starting from maybe 2008, 2009, and just growing and growing and growing. So speech and rhetoric is very important. What happened with the US and Russia, it's hard to say, but it really deteriorated. On the Russian side, I call it, two syndromes. One, initially, I call it the Rodney Dangerfield syndrome. It was, I don't get no respect. And the Russians felt bad that they didn't get any respect because they mentally were a superpower, but they were no longer a superpower. You got to remember, what collapsed in 1991 was not just a country. What collapsed was also a sphere of influence that was tailored in Yalta. And so the remaining, the smaller, leaner bear that remained kept wandering around, growling in search of his terrain, his sphere of influence. It was no longer there. There was one sphere. And everybody who had been in that bear sphere was heading to the other sphere, knocking on the door saying, can we come in? Can we come in? Do you have room in the stockade? That's where this all started out. And the other one, I think the other syndrome is, you can tell I'm a couch potato. The other one is Glenn Close syndrome from Fatal Attraction, where she tells, at one point she tells Michael Douglas, I will not be ignored. And that was Russia's mindset, I will not be ignored. And that happened right around the middle of the 2010s. So there's a lot of, one guy in a comedy show said, there's a material for a whole conference of psychologists there. And it still continues, and it's deteriorating. And the scary part is that I've never heard such bad rhetoric. I've never heard things about, well, we're going to go to heaven and you're all going to burn in purgatory. If nuclear war breaks out, what does that mean? How do you interpret that? So I'm really worried. I've never lived through this kind of worrying time.
We in the United States, if we're honest, we think we're the center of the world. We do. The United States.
To a certain extent you are.
And we're used to being that way. When we travel, we expect people there to speak English. We have an expectation.
You and the Brits.
Yeah, but when they traveled, they took over the countries. But there's this expectation, I think, and I'm speaking just for myself, not for NBC4, but I do think that we have a certain arrogance in this country. And I wonder if you can tell us how we are viewed on the world stage. How does the rest of the world view America right now?
There's no one answer to this question, you're viewed by different countries in different places. And I guess, in as general a way, I could say that the saying familiarity breeds contempt is applicable in intergovernmental or intercountry relations, because those who, for example, those who know intimately well what it is to be a neighbor of very large countries in one part of the world, they crave to have a border with on the Rio Grande. Those who do have maybe a border or below, they maybe crave other areas where they don't know. It's the same thing as, the grass is greener on the other side. I think living next to a very large country is a challenge. Who was it? I think it was Pierre Trudeau who said that even for Canada, a huge country, being next to the U.S. is difficult, and you can't get a better relationship than that. So I can't speak for these countries, but of course there are countries that are vociferously anti-American, and then there are countries who clamor to be in America's stockade or in America's world. And I think that second category is more prevalent than the first one.
We are certainly aligned with, in a supportive and powerhouse way, with our NATO allies, who are now on one side of the war in Ukraine, and obviously on the other side is Russia. From the UN perspective, is this like herding cats? Because I know that I asked you a question back there that I found fascinating when you said criticism of the UN. When you're talking about the UN, what part of the UN? Really, the UN, we think of it as this united body, but there are different segments, aren't there, that have different levels of power?
It's the acronym United Nations is so large and it encompasses so many things that unless you define what you're talking about, who messed up or who was successful, you're not going to understand why that happened. And in this situation with regard to international conflicts, Ukraine has kind of taken over the headlines, but think back a year and a half ago, it was like, why can't the UN stop the killing in Syria, the conflict in Syria? And when you hear that, you say, okay, which UN? Is it my boss, the Secretary General, who's a hired president, hired by the members of the board of the UN, which is 193 members, and who run the organization and who call the shots? Or is it the Security Council, 15 member states, who are responsible, or who is the Security Council responsible for maintaining peace and security in the world? Or is it the 5 permanent members of the Security Council wielding the veto power who don't allow this or that resolution to go through if they think that it's not in their interest or in the interest of their client states? That's where the rubber hits the road. It's not the bureaucrats like me who make the decisions. It is the member states. As a funny anecdote, also very illustrative, the Secretary General has, I think it's a monthly lunch with the 5 permanent member ambassadors in New York. And it's sort of a, synchronize your watches and pep talk and so on. And so when Kofi Annan became Secretary General, he had a second or third lunch with the member states, with the permanent 5 ambassadors. And then Ambassador Lavrov, who's now foreign minister, said, Kofi, 3 months have passed and you've been talking about this reform and this and that, and we don't see much. It took God 6 days to create the world. Kofi Annan, in his typical way, understated and soft-spoken, he said, yes, Sergei, yes, you're right, you're absolutely right. But God was working alone. and I have to work with you guys. And that is really illustrative of the problem, because you have to work with all countries and you have to serve all countries, and sometimes they make it impossible.
You have diplomacy in your genes, your father, and you very kindly, you have a book that you've written in 3 languages, by the way, about your father. So tell me how growing up in that atmosphere of international diplomacy I mean, your dinner conversation tape must have been quite different than my conversations at home with my Irish Catholic immigrants.
Well, I mean, yeah, I know what you're asking, but, dinner conversations in families are pretty similar. Except, of course, what really I think you're asking is, I did watch my dad in action. As far as a 10-year-old kid at home can see and can discern things from the snippets that he hears his father telling his mother, or picking up things. In that sense, I always say that if my parents had been doctors and I grew up thumbing through a medical atlas, I'd probably have gone in for medicine. Yeah, of course it had a big influence on my choice of
What was
career.
your father's role again?
Oh, he started out as a junior diplomat in 1967. He was vice consul in the Consulate General in Bombay in India, and we went there with him for 2 years. I had a wonderful Indian nanny who gave me a very thick Indian accent, apparently. And when I got to, my dad was then moved to London. We spent 4 years there. And I started getting bad marks in English. And the teacher told my dad, well, listen to this kid, that was actually a very formative experience, because I have in me, obviously I'm a Georgian, always was, always will be. I have a Soviet aspect, of course, but not an ideological kind of a Soviet, but I just grew up in that system. And I have definitely an Anglo-Saxon part in me, which originates not from my time in the United States, but from those 4 years in London, between the ages of 10 and 14. In the end, what you see is what happened, and I was formed like that. So, of course, my dad's thing. And that book has a few anecdotes on how I saw his work, because the photos there, it's in his words, but it's things that were part of our family discussion, and he said, yeah, put that in there. He went through all that before he passed away, so it is in his own words.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
As you now are heading toward retirement, and I did not know until today, there's a mandatory retirement at the United Nations.
Unless you become a really big shot, then you don't have to.
But as you head toward retirement, what do you want your legacy to be there?
My legacy?
Yours, yes, your
Personal?
time,
Wow.
yeah.
Oh, you really are making me feel really like a great man. I retire. Usually there's, people forget who was in this position last week, So my personal legacy, though, what I would, well, first of all, everything I've ever done. When I was in Washington, working at the Soviet embassy, in the ambassador's office of the embassy of one superpower in the capital of the other, my unstated objective was to be as helpful as possible to understanding and to getting things done. I don't have a bureaucratic bone in my body. I don't start an answer by saying, oh, no, it's impossible. No, everything is possible, it's just how you get it done. So I think most Washingtonians caught on pretty soon that there was this clown at the Soviet embassy who actually picked up his phone, and he actually returned calls. And that's always been my modus operandi. So in the UN, we have a lot of bureaucracy. And it's not because the worst of bureaucrats in the world are selected and put in one building. No, it's because we are a reflection of the member states of the organization, and they are all bureaucracies. All countries are bureaucracies. So that reflection reflects on the bureaucracy. And worst of all, these member states, acting in the format of the General Assembly, they take resolutions which sometimes are mutually exclusive. And that's why when the current Secretary General started looking at reform, he publicly said, if you had tried to create this kind of a intertwining set of mutually exclusive rules, you wouldn't have been able to. But it came about in this natural way. So cutting through that is very important, helping people cut through that. I know, unfortunately, a lot of colleagues who, for whatever reason, they play along with the bureaucracy. Oh, yes, well, you have to, write a request and then, requisition something. For me, I try to resolve things, and I hope that my legacy is that this guy used to resolve things. And another thing, it is an organization of the member states, and the member states are represented by their ambassadors. And the ambassadors change every 3-4 years. So the new ambassador who comes in doesn't have the institutional memory that I do, who's been in the UN for 30 years. Now, I'm not telling anybody publicly that I escaped from the Jurassic Park island, but I did. And so they call me for background information, back channel diplomacy, we need to do this and that. What would you suggest? What would you advise? They call, they come and talk, often about confidential things. That's one of the most wonderful parts, the diplomacy aspect. I'm not opposed to, or I've never disliked the bureaucratic part of reading and editing papers that come to the boss and vetting them and so on. It's part of the job, and I think that if you finally, if you come out with a solid paper, well drafted, well argumented, it's a contribution to bureaucracy. It's not to good bureaucracy. So I think my legacy overall, I hope, will be that people will remember that this guy got things done.
It's a pretty good legacy to have. We in the United States right now think of it's us, it's China, it's Russia. It's these three superpowers. We're at odds with the other two. They seem to be friendly with each other. How concerned should we be?
Well, look, the relationship in that triangle has always been one that defined the rest of the international relationships. When those three guys up there have a cold, the rest of the world develops pneumonia. I think at present, that relationship is at its worst. I've never seen this relationship, even when I wasn't watching, but I read about it, I don't think it was this bad. The U.S., I think, I said I cannot comment on domestic affairs, and I certainly shouldn't be commenting on what the U.S. should or shouldn't be doing. But I think there needs to be sort of dialing back a little bit of the rhetoric and try to sort of sort things out, give diplomacy more leeway, cut more slack to diplomacy.
We are heading into a presidential election year. The
Bad time for
possibility
foreign.
of dialing back the rhetoric is
I know.
pretty dim and distant.
You know the saying that an election is a bad time for good policy and a good time for bad policies. Yeah, it goes first and foremost for international relations. So, but there are nuances here. The Russians and the Chinese have a common objective is to not have the U.S. overbearingly influence their their sort of neck of the woods. But they are not sort of, buddy-buddy for forever. They haven't been. You'll remember that in 1971, Richard Nixon opened up to China. And in February 1971, the Nixon administration allowed, or I would say engineered, the changeover of the Chinese seat in the UN from the Kuomintang, i.e. Taiwan, which was the owner of the Chinese seat and of the Chinese permanent seat in the Security Council, to that of the People's Republic of China. And he put that gift in his back pocket, and February 72 went to Beijing and pulled the gift out for Mao Zedong. Why? Because in May 72, he was heading to the Soviet Union. And that was a signal to, oh, Leonid, hello, we're no longer enemies, so you better take heed. So it's always been a triangular sort of diplomacy, the China card, the Soviet card, the American card, excuse me. And so that needs to be remembered, that there is this, and frankly, as somebody who worked in the Soviet system, in the Soviet foreign ministry, I always saw, and as a scholar, that the economic side between the US and the Soviets never had any real connection. It was usually at the governmental level, they would sign something, but then there was the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, so the trade part never kicked in. Certainly didn't kick in at the level of private enterprise or state companies in the Soviet Union. So there was nothing to lose economically and trade-wise. Whereas with China, the U.S., when this whole rhetoric started in the Trump administration, I was wondering, how are the U.S. and China going to disentangle their economies and their trade? Because it is so fused, I would even say. And I asked a few major transnational, international corporation leaders, I said, how do you see that? I said, am I wrong? I said, no, you're not wrong at all. I mean, we're also waiting to believe it when we see it. But obviously, as international, transnational corporations, we're going to play by the rules that the member states or the countries put in place. But if that's going to start happening, we're going to be losing a lot of money. Yeah. So it's a difficult relationship, but it need not become even more difficult. And one thing that no country wants, even a country as big and powerful as the United States, is a potential conflict on two fronts or with two other big boys. They may not stack up to the US together even, and they won't. But you don't want to go there. You really don't want to go there.
Well, Doug is in the back of the room. We do take questions from the audience, and I see I'm past time for when I should have done that. So I know you also have some questions coming in from online, and we ask you keep your questions brief. And Doug, take it away.
Colleen, thank you, and David, thank you very much. This is a terrific conversation. If you do have a question, please come up and line up here behind me. We'll alternate questions from the live stream audience and questions from those of you here in the room today. This question, the United States and the former Soviet Union never went directly to war with one another, thank goodness. Was this the result of diplomacy, luck, or something else? If it was luck, will our luck ever run out?
Well, that's a great question. There's a whole book in there, I think, in the answer to that question. It was by design, it was by smart diplomacy, and it was luck in the sense of having responsible leaders, not only at the top, but also at the second and third tier and in legislatures as well. So there was only one time when American troops were in Archangel. That was the beginning of the Soviet Civil War. It was 1920, I think it was. But they never engaged in any military activity, and they were withdrawn afterwards. But no, and we're definitely, as you said, lucky that it never happened. But there was also an understanding that if that happens, it's going to be, a very, I don't know if it would have been the end of the world, but it would certainly be the end of societies as we knew. So, yeah, that was a combination of all these.
Could you introduce yourself as well?
Thank you. I'm Bill Wayhoff. I'm with Steptoe and Johnson. We're a law firm, and I think everyone here is really grateful you're here. I wondered if you could make any comments about the relationship between Mr. Gorbachev and President Reagan. Thank you.
I was lucky enough, I've already dated myself, so I'm not afraid of doing that more. I was lucky enough to be in Washington already. I wasn't present at their first meeting in 1985 in Geneva, but in 85 I was already in Washington, and I was part of the preparatory team for the 1987 summit. And by then, they'd already hit it off pretty well. Their first meeting was a little difficult, but it was difficult not because of their personalities. It was difficult because of the not very good Soviet interpreter. In order to be a good interpreter, you need to not only know the language well, you need to understand the mentality of the other language and of the other individual, and you also need to have a little bit of sense of humor, and you need to, when somebody is weaving a joke into their narrative, you need to be able to translate that, interpret that. So I can tell you a reaction from somebody who was very close to Ronald Reagan, Charles Wick, who was director of the USIA, United States Information Agency. And he came to see my boss, the ambassador, and I was taking part in the meeting as note taker, but also interpreter, because my boss could speak English, but he didn't understand English. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but he could say rudimentary things himself, but he couldn't understand the fine point. And so Wick, this is 1986. This is a few months after Geneva, and he says, and he was kind of an outspoken, colorful guy. He said, I'm wondering about your president. Doesn't he have a sense of humor? I mean, my president is all about one-liners, and he likes to put in jokes are part of his, breaking the ice approach. Sorry, I keep gesticulating. It's much more difficult when I have a glass of red wine. I've done that. And so he said, what, doesn't he have a sense of humor? Because my president tells him one joke, he doesn't laugh. He tells him another joke, he doesn't laugh. And then we started suspecting that maybe it's your interpreter. So I'm going to tell you, Mr. Ambassador, a joke, and I'm going to test your interpreter if he manages to tell the joke in such a way that you laugh. And I interpreted that, and then I added in Russian, I said, laugh whatever I say. And he tells this joke, which actually was a funny joke. He said, there's a notice on a lamppost says "dog lost." Description is white with a black patch on his left side. He's missing his right eye, has part of his left ear bitten off. He's limping on his hind right leg, and part of his front left leg is mangled. Answers to the name Lucky. So I managed to interpret that, and the ambassador says, "It's really funny. Well done, good." So I think that was their initial problem. The problem that the first ladies had a little bit was that Mrs. Gorbachev, she was a really sweet lady. I worked a lot with her, and she was really nice to me always. Not the monster that some people had described her as, but she was didactic. She was a Soviet Ph.D., philosophy, and as most educated Soviets, she was well-versed in literature and artwork and so on, so she tried to show that off. And I didn't really go over well with Nancy at first. But then they were fine together. And I watched them together in Washington in 87, and then in 1988 for the so-called Three Presidents Summit when George Bush was already president-elect, but Reagan was still president. This is December '88, when the big earthquake happened. Well, there I go again, as Ronald Reagan would say. The big earthquake in Armenia happened in December 1988, and Gorbachev's visit was cut short, and they left back to Spitak to visit the place. So the relationship was good, and actually it was, they set up an excellent base of the relationship. And I guess Ronald Reagan was the right guy to do it, because there was no thunder from the right with Reagan. He was the right. And so he could do that, as Mr. Spock in one of the Star Trek movies says, only Nixon could go to China. So similarly, and then Gorbachev actually was worried sick when Bush became president, although they had established an excellent relationship. And Bush actually told him, riding in his limo when he was vice president in Washington, he said, Mikhail, I'm going into an election campaign. Look at what I do, don't listen to what I say. But despite that, and despite their good relationship, because of the pause, it's known in history as the pause that the Bush administration took in its Soviet relationship, that pause lasted for about a month and a half, 2 months, and Gorbachev was really worried, wondering whether his buddy George was backtracking on the foundation that Gorbachev had built with Reagan. But it was a brilliant move on Secretary Baker's part. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. David, thanks for coming to Columbus. Hope you're able to enjoy our beautiful city while you're here. My name's Shane. I'm the CEO and founder of Mediation Table. My question for you is, as a diplomat, what is the single greatest or the most difficult conversation you've ever had? Who is it with, and what happened?
Oh, where do I begin? I think the most difficult type of conversation is when you represent your country and you have to explain a really difficult thing that your country did without checking with you, and you have to justify it somehow or not justify it. It all depends on your own integrity, how far you go, and there are ways of doing this. And probably for me, for my generation, the most difficult situation was answering questions about Afghanistan. How is it that the Soviets presented it as international assistance, fraternal assistance to a friendly country when the airborne troops took Kabul and killed the president, who had actually, for whatever reason, had requested that the Soviets intervene. So, sometimes these difficult situations don't have a straightforward reply. So, but I've never done what some of the some of the ambassadors of countries who have been in a similar predicament do by spewing this official propaganda and insulting people's intelligence. I've tried to avoid doing that while not being disrespectful or disloyal to my own country. That's the difficult choreography right there.
I feel like that's what the definition of a diplomat is.
Yeah, and the definition of diplomat, one definition that I do not subscribe to is that a diplomat is somebody sent abroad to lie for his country. That's, if you lie, the first time you lie is probably going to be the last time you lie, because you're not going to be related to, you're not going to be respected, you're not going to be sought out for discussion. And one of my mentors, somebody that I respect enormously, Secretary of State, former Secretary of State James Baker, always used to say, not didactically, but always used to say, David, the best diplomacy is honesty, but you got to do your homework. And that's the best thing about diplomats like Baker. They do their homework to such an extent that you sit across the table from them, 10 times out of 10, they're going to best you. But you're going to go away 10 times out of 10 saying, what a guy, he beat me fair and square, he didn't snooker me. That's a real diplomat.
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Hediye. I'm a fine art student at CCAD.
Sorry, I'm getting a little, we from Jurassic Park have different problems. Could you speak louder, please?
Yeah, hello, my name is Hediye, and I'm a fine art student at the CCAD. Also, I'm from Iran. I have two questions. The first question is that, what's your opinion on Iranian demand and need for nuclear technology? And the second question is that so many people believe that Iran is really close to another revolution. What's your opinion of that, on that? And also,
It's very close to
revolution.
a revolution.
And if something happened, what's your opinion? How much it might be effect on the Middle East countries?
How much there might be effect?
Yes, on the Middle East countries.
Iran is a major country. It's not a small player. Whether before the revolution, whether since the revolution, it's a major player in whatever aspect it plays in. And it's managed to survive under sanctions for over 40 years. With regard to nuclear weapons, there is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which precisely is on the books in order to give a chance to countries to have a nuclear power program for civilian use and preclude proliferation of nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, that treaty is not being adhered to as it should. And there again, politics and international politics takes over. If we just look at the simple facts, the Soviets got the bomb because the US had the bomb. The Chinese got the bomb because the Soviets had the bomb. The Indians got the bomb because the Chinese got the bomb. The Pakistanis got the bomb because the Indians had the bomb. Okay? North Korea got the bomb because it was scared stiff. It knew that it would have to change, but it was a way to show that, don't tread on me. I've got nuclear weapons. And you know the equation. If Iran gets the bomb, then Arab countries will want an Arab bomb. So the international non-proliferation regime has to be strengthened. And unfortunately, it's not being strengthened. The member states of the organization, the United Nations, who need to show, especially those who have the most weapons, who need to show that, we've had these weapons for over 70 years. They serve no purpose. We can't use them. They are only for intimidation, and it's a black hole money-wise. So, don't go there. Instead of that, those who have these weapons are perfecting them, and those who don't have them, looking at the main nuclear powers, they're saying, well, we also want them. So it's a bad thing. About the revolution, it's very hard to say. Iran is a pretty closed society. There is much more, of course, we all see that there's much more discontent, and it comes out in the streets, but whether that spells an imminent revolution is hard to say. It's difficult to say. Thank you.
And we thank you. This has been such a fascinating hour to be able to delve into the mind of someone who has seen what you've seen and done what you've done. Please give him a Columbus welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Colleen, for an excellent moderation. Thank you, Jane, again for having me here. Thank you. You've been a terrific audience, and if I've said something that'll get me fired, I'm going to come back here and find a job.
Well, as somebody who studied political science in the early and mid-'80s, I was fascinated and delighted by everything that Dr. Chikvaidze shared with us today. But I'm doubly happy that he could be here as an oral historian to share with all of us and to continue to help us understand the importance of diplomacy and of forums like this where people can talk civilly and respectfully to one another, to share their points of view and to move forward together. So with that, I want to thank today's sponsors, Delta Airlines, and our partners, the Columbus Council on World Affairs and NBC4, and also thank the Grange Insurance Audubon Center, our virtual seat patrons, and the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation. Let's give all of them and our speakers, Dr. Chikvaidze and Colleen Marshall, a big hand. Well, please make plans to join us next Wednesday when we are addressing the gender and pay gap in STEM right here at the Grange Insurance Audubon Center. We thank all of you for being with us today.